Okay, so imagine this. It's 2023, and you have the worst idea in the world. You want to ask me who I think are the best SSRs in 2023 for NA. I would say that this year is far more impactful than previous years as far as the meta is concerned, as this is the year the game shifts from having a single card type dominate the meta to us having an option between Buster and Arts, and the following year we get Quick thrown into the mix here. It's at the point where in JP all card types are viable, and it really depends on what you're doing in the game that dictates the servant use, not the card type itself. As far as the criteria of this list, it's mostly just based on my own personal experiences with them, as well as just my knowledge of how other people use these servants. I will say that for non-support servants, I would recommend, if you really want to use them, to try and get NP2 of them at least. Some of them are quite lackluster if they're just NP1. So anyway, let's start off the list with the most important servant of the year, which I presume everybody already knows, and that is Koyanskaya. Vich is the main enabler of Buster support in the game right now, and there really isn't much comparison. Merlin wasn't ever really used for farming, and general supports don't have the tools needed for Buster servants to work. Vich, on the other hand, has a 50% battery and lowers the cooldowns with her charge, so Buster units that have a 50% battery can use their MP 3 times in a row as long as they start with a K-scope. If you don't have a K-scope, you can get away with just swapping in another 50% charger, but if you have a single K-scope, non-MLB, you can apply a Pen 2 and get away with it as well. She's also one of the few good farming assassins. You can use her in a team with Double Vich and Oberon in order to farm riders. On top of that, she can be kept at level 70 and have full access to her kit and be used as taunt fodder during challenge quests in order to leave the field to allow more buffers in. And really, until recently, I only had a single level 70 copy of Vich, and I honestly never felt like I particularly needed a level 90 copy. But if you're not interested in esports applications with the servant and you want to use them for farming, I would definitely recommend MP2. Vich honestly is a must roll in the game due to what she enables though for farming, and if you really have to pick just one servant to roll this year, Vich is the one. Up next is also probably expected, and that is Oberon. Oberon at first glance looks like he would be something that feeds into the Buster meta and would be primarily used with them, but that actually isn't really the case. His third skill, while having a Buster buff, also doubles the effect of all MP damage up skills, which makes him invaluable support for Arts and Quick teams as well, especially when doing challenge quests or 90++ nodes. Oberon is what I would call a secondary support, where a main support is something like Scotty, Castoria, and Vich. Secondary supports are what you bring to complement or add onto the effects of the main one, characters like Tamamo and Lady Avalon and Oberon, though Oberon is far and above the best of these secondary supports due to having a 70% charge and the MP damage multiplier. Thanks to that MP damage multiplier, if you're looking to get the most damage out of an MP, combining him with a Black Grail will yield insane numbers. It really, honestly, there's nothing else that can compare to it. Other than supporting, he can be technically used for farming. As a pretender, he's the opposite of an AoE alter ego, so you would use him to farm knight classes. But let's be honest, you need him at a pretty high MP level, like MP 3+ from my experience. So for most people, you just get one copy and use him for his buffs. You really don't need to worry about using him for farming. At number 3, we have Morgan, which may be shocking to some of you since this list is coming from me. As it stands, Morgan is the best servant to use for farming with Vich. Considering she has a 50% charge and is a berserker, she's able to work on all 333 nodes, as well as 90+ nodes with weird arrangements. She does kind of fall short of damage on 90++ nodes, but you can still use her since most of those are done with 2 attackers instead of a single attacker. She does require a K-scope though, and preferably a level 100 MLB K-scope for the extra attack stat, but she can work with a normal K-scope and a Pen 2, just really try to avoid the cope scope. Thanks to having an anti-man trait, there's a decent selection of enemies and servants her MP can have a damage bonus against, which helps since she's a berserker and only does 1.5 damage. Morgan and Vich is about as straightforward as a team as you can make in this game. You don't really have to worry about classes, you don't have to worry about MP gain, you just press the buttons in the right order and you clear the stage. As far as boss fights are concerned, you can just throw a Black Grail on her, bring Oberon as well, plug suit him in, buff up, and kill everything. For number 4 and a personal number 1 is Melusine. Melusine's actually a rather strange servant, but not in a strange way that's like confusing gameplay-wise or strange looking or anything of the sort. She's strange because she's obscenely strong and is by far the best DPS in the game for boss fights because of how flexible she is. I'm sure it's rather well known at this point, but to quickly go over the NP situation, in stages 1 to 2, she has a single target arts NP, and in stage 3, she has an AoE buster NP with invuln ignore. Her skill 3 grants her 100% charge in stage 1 and 2, as well as invincibility for the turn, and changes her to stage 3. In stage 3, it grants her NP damage up and invincibility again, but no charge this time. This allows her to change MP types mid-fight if needed and makes her extremely flexible in 90+ and 90++ nodes, where she can take out a single enemy in the first wave and then AoE down a group on the second or third wave. She also has quite high neutral damage, so outside of fighting sabers, you can really just use her for farming anything, not just archers. Though there is a downside using her for farming, and that is she is terrible at 3-3-3 farming. Since the 100% charge only works once, she has to have Oberon swapped in on turn 3 in order to do a normal 3-3-3 farming loop, and that's why she's primarily used for 90+ and 90++ nodes, where on those there are usually 2 attackers anyway for most of them, and you're already swapping people in, so it really doesn't present itself as an issue in those situations. The biggest downside of Melusine, though, is since you're usually going to start in stage 1 or 2, even if you're doing a buster setup, is that it always changes you to the default stage 3, and you can never really see the red dragon form. I really demand that they buff her 3rd skill to allow us to choose the outfit used. It's honestly unacceptable. I demand this be fixed immediately, though I will take a summer form as an acceptable substitute. At number 5 is the first servant that isn't associated with Lost Belt 6, and that is Summer Kama. In my opinion, Kama is one of the best neutral arts loopers in the game, beating out even Space Ishtar. And while Space Ishtar is good, of course, and does work with Vich in a buster situation, I personally find Kama easier to use, and there's no RNG when it comes to the card type buff, whereas with Space Ishtar, you can be in a situation where you don't get the arts proc, and then you're a short a percent or two, whereas Kama, it's always going to be the same thing throughout, and you're not going to be affected by bad RNG. Kama does come with some RNG, though. They couldn't let her off scot-free, as she does extra damage to charm targets with her NP, so against enemies that resist the charm on her skill 2, or are simply immune to debuffs, her damage can be lower than you would expect. But I think that planning around a buff missing is far easier than planning around whether you can loop it all in the first place. She does also come out right after Vich and Oberon, so it's a bit strange to get an arts looper right as we're getting into buster farming teams, but thankfully they aren't trying to neuter looping anymore, it feels like, and she functions perfectly fine. And unrelated to farming, I mean, kind of, she also has the 2nd highest attack in the game, only 30 attack below Jean Alter, and at 120 that's actually only 40 attack below Jean Alter, and that certainly helps since she's going to be doing neutral farming most of the time. But speaking of her position on the list of highest attack stat, number 3 on that list is also a concern for Summer Kama. That is Summer Ibuki, who is a berserker and is also amazing at looping and farming as well, and also has some utility. I would say if you're dead set on Ibuki and you can wait a year, Kama's perfectly fine to skip over. But otherwise, I do think that she's a great choice and a personal favorite of mine, even though it took me a year to get her, which included me hitting Pity, but Pity didn't exist at the time, so I didn't actually get anything. So you know what? It ended up having to come down to a GSSR, and then they put her up for a rate up later. Yeah, I'm not bitter about that at all. No, don't. For number 6, I have one that's probably going to shock people, and that would be Miss Crane. And as I said, this list is based on my experiences in the game primarily, and I do enjoy challenge quests quite a bit. And Miss Crane is unfortunately very useful for that. I say unfortunately because as far as supports go, she's by far the most annoying to actually use due to the restrictions on her MP and the effects of her skills. Her first skill gives party invincibility, except for herself, for 1 turn, and that's great. You give 10 stars for every servant with a costume on the field, which is a weird set of servants, and 10 stars isn't enough. It becomes an issue later. Her second skill is 100% MP charge, but it applies a taunt to the other 2 party members, and in 99% of fights, you don't want your main DPS to be taunted. You would rather have the other support targeted. So unfortunately, a lot of the time, you would end up using her with a K-scope, or if you're running her in an arts team, you can use a 50 to 75% charge C depending on her append 2, and just finish the rest of it off with Castoria. Then of course is her NP, which needs 20 stars to activate it. So if you're paying attention, that means that if you're using her first skill to generate stars, you'd need 2 servants with outfits. But Vich is the only servant with an outfit, and that's only at Lost Belt 7. So that's very restrictive. So if you're running Castoria or Scotty, you have to bring a star entry CE or have a way to generate stars so that you can use her MP. Once you actually get her MP off, that's kind of where this annoying stuff works out. Her MP gives a 20 to 40% attack buff based on MP level, 30% MP damage buff, and 30 to 50% MP charge depending on overcharge to the person who is first in the party slot except herself. And then she gets out. She leaves the field. Another effect is it actually does reset the deck, so unlike Plug Suit, which doesn't reset the deck, the cards are actually fresh the next turn. So like if you have a servant with a single arts card and you get it turn 1 and she leaves, you can have that arts card again the next turn. This is a useful MP because sometimes in challenge quests there's not enough damage on turn 1 to actually force a swap out and bring in another support. So if you have a servant taunted and the boss attacks but they don't do enough damage and they don't die, well, that runs over, you're stuck because you needed that additional damage. Miss Crane solves that by simply just leaving herself and allows more supports to come in. You can have her MP go off first if you need the attack and MP damage up on the first turn, or you can have it go second to grant 35% MP charge at overcharge 2, which can make looping easier for your main DPS. And going back to the starting charge C I mentioned before, you can pull off having her NP and then swap her back in, use her skill 2, and then leave again. Now, her being number 6 on this list is rather high up, but for brand new accounts, I would actually not recommend her. Not at all, really. She's very dependent on having an established account and benefits you the more developed your account is. For a new player, you're better off getting the first 3, Vitch, Oberon, and Morgan, because that makes your game much easier to go through. Also, she's just very hard to get footage of because she's on screen for all of 5 seconds before she gets out. The next 3 are actually rather interchangeable, to be honest, as they're all good farmers, just with slightly different flavors to them. Karen is who I would personally recommend simply due to her being a great neutral quick farmer, and is rather comparable to Dante's in the damage department. Without considering traits, she's 3rd on the AoE quick servant list, losing only to Dante's and Summer Scotty. She has a somewhat unique mechanic for looping as well, where her first skill drains 10% charge from the other 2 party members every turn and gives it to herself. So every turn she can pull in 20% charge from the supports. On top of that, she has a split 50% charge, so you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to getting enough charge to NP every turn. The downside to that, of course, is that your supports have to have that 20% NP charge to begin with, but there's actually 2 ways around this. One of them is good and one of them is terrible. The simplest way to do this is to just have both of the Scotties have their Pen 2 maxed out, and this is normal Scotty or Summer Scotty. The terrible method is to take advantage of the other effect of her skill 1, which grants NP generation increase to the party, and have your Scotty's face card first in order to generate that NP. But don't do that. RNG farming is a bad idea and never fun. As a bonus, her NP does give an AoE buff block for one time, which can be useful in challenge quests. Really, she's just an overall good quick farmer if you're looking for an alternative to Donkers. Following Karen is the first AoE quick servant that I'm aware of that can 3-turn loop with a Black Grail, Summer Okita Alter. Now, I say she can loop with Black Grail, but it's a bit rough at first. It's certainly possible with normal Scotty, but it requires high MP levels and is very tight. Become Summer Scotty, it's much more lenient and you don't need as high of MP levels. For most of the game's history, farming Lancers has been one of the hardest and most annoying to farm, as there haven't really been a lot of good options for Sabers. You had things like Lakshmi, who was not loopable at all, or Jason and Summer Tomoe, which is great, I'm sure, as we all know. But come this year, we actually get quite a few good options. You can go with Buster strategies and just use the OG Saber, but if you're looking for quick and the possibility of using Events Ease, with the caveat that if they don't have starting charge, you are locked into 2K4 Mystic Code, then Okita Alter is a great consideration in that department. Okita Alter is far more well-rounded versus the other AoE Sabers as well. She has a 2-hit invuln, a quick, buster, and attack up, as well as a 3-turn crit damage up. Considering how she also has a 2Q, 2B deck, she pairs fabulously with Summer Scotty, which enables her to have some decent buster crits. On top of that, her NP removes any defensive buffs on the enemy before damage. Though this won't affect boxed buffs, it can still be useful for some challenge quests. Her battery is only 30%, but when combined with her Pen 2, it's functional enough to be able to loop with no starting charge at all. It's also worth noting that her Pen 3 is anti-Berserker, and while that's not as useful as it being anti-Lancer, it's certainly better to have a somewhat useful Pen 3 than one that is completely pointless. Up next is everyone's favorite arts looping saber, Muramasa. Now, Muramasa is the first real looping saber we get in the game, beating out the previous competition of Jason, and if you're insane enough, Summer Tomoe. I'm sure some of you may think that I'm a bit crazy putting Muramasa this far down on the list, as I think he's one of the more hyped servants in the game outside of the Lost Belt 6 servants. But from personal experience, Muramasa is good, but he's not a one-stop shop for farming. He has good damage for an AoE Saber, but he loses to Okita Altar by a decent amount, as well as Ibuki and Artoria. You can say that he can farm with Black Grail instead, or an Event C, but the Okita Altar can pull that off as well. On top of that, his MP gain really isn't the greatest. Since he only has a 3-hit MP, that makes getting enough charge to use his MP the next turn an issue sometimes. He's certainly not free from the shackles of NP generation increasing Mystic Codes, that's for sure. There have been many times when I was farming, and I would have to use his skill 1, which is a 1-turn buff, in order to loop on turn 2. And this is coming from someone with an MP5 level 100 Muramasa. If he has these issues at level 100, I can certainly imagine these issues are even more pronounced if you're using him at anything less. Now this may seem like a lot of complaints about him, but this is by no means me saying he's bad, but I feel that these are things that people should be aware of when rolling for him. Overall, he's a good servant, one that I feel like you won't regret getting if you manage to roll him, but just don't expect him to overpower things like the first 4 servants on this list do. Alright, so this next one I'm sure is going to have some people disagreeing with me since it's this far down, but it's Tyra. Tyra is a servant that I would say falls into the group of soloists. That's a group that's spearheaded by servants like Van Gogh, Super Orion, and King Hassan, as that would make you think she's good at staying alive and going 1v1 in a fight, and that's aided by the fact that she has a guts that stacks with other guts. So this allows you to do things like use CEs that have guts on them, or use the Mystic Code that has guts on it, or other servants that grant guts, in order to keep her alive and going even though she's taking hits. On top of that, when her guts is proc, she gets a damage buff to her NP, which is great because she is an Avenger, and that means she's going to be hitting neutral damage most of the time. And thankfully, while she does have a trait advantage against Genji enemies, they don't go all in on this and limit the rest of her kit because of the insane 200% damage mod against Genji. Her skill 1 gives a 100% crit up for 3 turns, as well as charging her MP. She also has a 2-hit evade and attack up, as well as that stackable guts I mentioned earlier. The thing though is, personally, if you're looking for a solo servant, or at least if I'm looking for a solo servant, Super Orion or Van Gogh are often a better choice in my opinion. And as far as boss killers are concerned, since you're looking at neutral damage, if you want a single target, you could just go for Melusine this year and she'll work just fine in that regard. If I had to draw a line on this list, I would say that she's the last servant here that I can honestly recommend going for outside of just liking them though, since she accomplishes what you would expect of her and she isn't overshadowed by the competition too much, which I can't really say for the last 4 servants on this list. Coming in at number 11, we have Jacques de Molay, I don't know how to say that correctly, an AoE quick foreigner with a 50% battery, and the ability to change your team to evil alignment. Molay is an unfortunate servant as she falls into the genre of neutral quick loopers, but she doesn't have the damage to make her worth choosing over Karen. She has a mechanic of changing the party to evil alignment, but that is functionally kind of pointless. Her skill 2 relies on them being evil to get an invuln from it, but having to press skill 1 and then skill 2 in order for it to work properly isn't really that interesting, nor does it grant many other benefits. Her skill 3 does grant her the ability to do extra damage to cursed targets, 50% in fact, but here's the problem. She has no way of adding curse to targets outside of her MP, and for a challenge quest you can get around that through various means, like using a CC with the curse effect first, or using a servant that can apply curse to the enemy. But in a farming situation, there's no real practical way to do that 3 times in a row and have her loop, so you just have to settle for lower damage. She does have a split 50% battery, so she is flexible, but as I said before, they're just better options for quick loopers, so personally I think she's rather easy to skip over. Following that is the first servant that loses to the 4 stars in their class, Sakamoto Ryoma. I think the best reason I can give as to why he's this far down on the list is just AoE Arts Lancer. There are too many good AoE Arts Lancers in this game for me to honestly recommend Ryoma. If you like him, sure, you can use him. He actually has higher damage than all the other AoE Arts Lancers, but considering the amount of choices you have for AoE Arts Lancers and that a majority of them are 4 stars, having to get an MP5 5-star just to be better than an easier to obtain 4-star is a rather tough pill to swallow. And here's the thing, Melt and Percival are just better options for the most part. Melt gets quite a few rate ups recently, and Percival is part of the Lost Belt 6 servants, so of course he's good. On top of that, he's general pool, so he can show up at any time, and his damage is comparable to Melt. Both of them are easily able to loop their NP due to their battery or high hit counts, and Ryoma unfortunately has the same problem as Muramasa, a 3 hits art NP. He unfortunately can struggle to loop in some situations unless you pair him with specific mystic codes. You may look at his MP and see the 50% defense buff that it grants him and presume it makes him more survivable. But then you could also look at the 4 stars like Fion, Melt, and Percival and see that they all have some form of evade or invulnerability, which for the most part is just better than defense up. So in the end, he's not terrible, but he's just trying to enter a space where there are too many better and cheaper alternatives. On the other hand, Kermit shows up in their Stage 4 art, so the choice is yours. I honestly don't have much to say about the next servant, Tai Gong Wang. To be honest, he's just kind of okay. He's general pool, and in fact the only general pool 5-star we get this year. Being general pool, though, usually means they're just not that great, and he certainly doesn't buck that trend. He does have a 50% battery, and he can loop with Scotty, but his team buffs are kind of anemic, and he's not really that great as a support either. If you were looking to use him for a support, you're actually just better off using Wu in this situation. He does at least have a power mod against Divine and Demonic, so he can pull off some numbers here and there, but all things considered, you can just ignore this and wait for him to spook you. At least it's a better spook than Achilles. Following that, we have Galatea, a single-target arts berserker that was outclassed right after she was released. Much to her dismay, Vlad gets a buff right after she comes out and becomes the top single-target arts berserker once again. She barely had any time to be the top dog. On top of that, later down the road, we get a 4-star single-target berserker, Creamhill, that's just an overall better option. Her main gimmick is that she removes all debuffs at the end of the turn for 3 turns, thanks to her skill 3, and that can be useful in some fights where they're just spamming debuffs on you on things like Kiara or Kama's fights, but honestly that's just not too much of an issue to where I think she's worth taking over other servants. On top of that, she only has a single arts card, so her spamming her MP is much harder since she has to be lucky enough to draw it. You can of course just go Buster with her face card since she has a triple Buster deck, but there's better options in the Berserker team for that as well. And with that, I've gone over every single... Oh, hold on a second. There's that one caster I always forget. What's her name? Oh, crap. Okuni, that's the one, right. Yeah, legitimately don't have any footage of her. I spent a good 10 minutes refreshing the support list and even checked non-friend supports to try and find one. Never came up. Never saw her once. No one has her on the support list. Technically, she's fine. She has a 50% battery and a single target, but she's a quick single target caster. So you're dealing with a damage penalty for casters, and that kind of just ruins everything. On top of that, her crit buff is only 1 turn. Thankfully, she does have Star Absorb that turn as well, because she only has like half the absorb of Ruler Scotty, and so if she didn't have that, she wouldn't even be able to crit on that 1 turn. In the end, she's not outright bad, but there's really nothing else outside of the novelty of her being a single target quick caster, so an easy pass for me. And with that said, that's my personal ranking for the servants that come out in 2023 for NA. This is, once again, just my personal list of who I recommend. There's certainly some weird choices like Miss Crane being up that high. That's just influenced by how I play the game. And you can just put it down at like number 12 or something like that if you're not playing the game the same way as me. So, it's all good. And remember, feel free to let me know how I am factually wrong on this list and how I should be banned from ever making rankings again. Goodbye.